Gentleman from Kansas yields. The chair will now recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for coming again to answer our questions. We know that over the last 17 months, there have been a number of allegations that have been made with respect to you, and when the facts and the testimony and the record don't support that, we seem to move on to the next, new allegation. One of the more recent ones is that Republicans are claiming that because you received emails from Sidney Blumenthal, that he was your primary source for intelligence. Now, Chairman Gowdy claimed that Mr. Blumenthal was, and I'm going to quote him here, quote, Secretary Clinton's primary advisor on Libya, because nearly half of all the emails sent to and from Secretary Clinton regarding Benghazi and Libya prior to the Benghazi terrorist attacks involved Sidney Blumenthal, end quote. He also claimed that Mr. Blumenthal was, and I'm quoting again, one of the folks providing her the largest volume of information about Libya. Secretary Clinton, was Sidney Blumenthal your primary policy advisor or your primary intelligence officer?
No, of course not.
Was he the primary source of information that you were receiving on Libya?
No, absolutely not.
Can you tell us then who were you receiving information from and in what form? Because there's been a particular emphasis on email communication and email communication only.
Well, as I testified earlier, I did not primarily conduct business on email with officials in our government. And I think the emails that have been produced this far demonstrate that as well. As I said, I got intelligence briefings from the intelligence community. I had a very experienced group of senior diplomats who knew quite a bit about Libya. Deputy Secretary Bill Burns had been our nation's top diplomat who actually had negotiated with Gaddafi. Prior to the entering in by the United States to support our European allies and Arab partners, I sent a team to meet with representatives of Gaddafi to see if there were some way that he would back down and back off of his increasingly hysterical threats against his own people. We had people like the ambassador that I referenced earlier who had served in Libya and had the occasion to observe and meet with Gaddafi. So we had a very large group of American diplomats, intelligence officers, and some private citizens who were experts in Libya who were available to our government. And we took advantage of every person we could with expertise to guide our decision making.
So would it be fair to say that you received information from Ambassador Stevens?
Yes.
The Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs?
Yes.
The Director of Policy Planning, Jacob Sullivan?
Yes.
The National Security Council?
Yes.
The Intelligence Community?
Yes.
The Defense Department?
Yes.
This weekend, one of our colleagues on this panel, Mr. Pompeo, went on Meet the Press, and I wonder if we could cue up the video. He had this exchange. Can we please play the video clip?
Mr. Blumenthal, it goes directly to this security issue. We see now that former Secretary relied on Mr. Blumenthal for most of her intelligence. That is, she was relying
that is
on
factually not
no,
correct.
it is absolutely
relied
factually
on Mr. Blumenthal for most of her intelligence.
Ms. Mitchell, take a look at the email trails, and you will see.
I cover the State Department. That is just factually not correct.
That clip, for me, just defies all logic, and I think Andrea Mitchell correctly called him out on something that was a falsehood. Secretary Clinton, what did you think when you heard that clip?
Well, that it was factually untrue. And I think your questioning and what I have stated today is a much clearer and more factual description of how we gathered information to make our decisions regarding Libya.
With your answer that you believe it to be factually incorrect, I just want to add that the Washington Post fact checker immediately awarded that claim for Pinocchio's, which is the worst rating possible. And I'm going to quote the Post on what they said about that quote. Looking at her private emails is just part of the picture, and it ignores the vast amount of information, much of it classified, that is available to the Secretary of State. Secretary Clinton, would you agree with that statement from the Washington Post?
Yes, I would.
Okay. So it seems to me, you know, there have been allegations that the work that this committee has done has been political in nature, and that much of the facts have already been decided before all of the evidence is in, including your testimony here today. When I see clips like that, it sort of supports the theory that this panel is not really interested in investigating what happened just prior to, the evening of, and immediately in the aftermath of September 11th, 2012, but that in fact there is another motive behind that. We have you here, and so while you are here, I want to make the most of your time and allow you to sort of debunk many of the myths that have been generated over the last 17 months, most of which have no factual basis for those being said. One is that you seemingly were disengaged the evening of September 11th, 2012. For example, Mike Huckabee accused you, as Mr. Cummings said, of ignoring the warning calls from dying Americans in Benghazi, and Senator Rand Paul stated that Benghazi was a 3 a.m. phone call that you never picked up. And Senator Lindsey Graham tweeted, "Where the hell were you on the night of the Benghazi attack?" Those appear to be based on the testimony of witnesses and the documentation that we have obtained in this committee and other previous committees. They seem to run counter to the truth because the testimony we've received states pretty much that you were deeply engaged the night of the attack. So can you describe for us what the initial hours of that night were like for you and how you learned about the attacks and what your initial thoughts and actions were?
Well, Congresswoman, I learned about the attacks from a State Department official rushing into my office shortly after or around 4 o'clock to tell me that our compound in Benghazi had been attacked. We immediately summoned all of the top officials in the State Department for them to begin reaching out. The most important quick call was to try to reach Chris himself. That was not possible. Then to have the diplomatic security people try to reach their agents, that was not possible. They were obviously defending themselves along with the ambassador and Sean Smith. We reached the second in command in Tripoli. He had heard shortly before we reached him from Chris Stevens telling him that they were under attack. We began to reach out to everyone we could possibly think who could help with this terrible incident. During the course of the following hours, obviously I spoke to the White House, I spoke to CIA Director Petraeus, I spoke to the Libyan officials because I hoped that there were some way that they could gather up and deploy those who had been part of the insurgency to defend our compound. I had conference calls with our team in Tripoli. I was on what's called a CIVITS, a video conference with officials who had operational responsibilities in the Defense Department, in the CIA, at the National Security Council. It was just a swirl and whirl of constant effort to try to figure out what we could do, and it was deeply distressing when we heard that the efforts by our CIA colleagues were not successful, that they had to evacuate the security officers, our diplomatic security officers, that they had recovered Sean Smith's body, and they could not find the ambassador. We didn't know whether he had escaped and was still alive or not.
If I may, because my time is running short, I just want to point out that you spoke with folks on the ground, you spoke with folks in the White House, the CIA, the Libyan president of the General National Congress. Now, interestingly enough, former director of the CIA, David Petraeus, has not been before this committee and has not spoken with this committee, but he did testify before the House Intelligence Committee in 2012, and he said that you personally called him and asked him for help that night. And I just want to end on this quote. Quote, "When Secretary Clinton called me later that afternoon to indicate that Ambassador Stevens was missing and asked for help, I directed our folks to ensure that we were doing everything possible, and that is, of course, what they were doing that night. Is that correct, Secretary?
That is, and also the Defense Department was doing everything it could possibly do. We had a plane bringing additional security from Tripoli to Benghazi. There was an enormous amount of activity. Everyone, it was all hands on deck. Everyone jumped in to try to figure out what they could do. The attack on the compound was very fast.
So would it be safe to say that you were fully engaged that evening?
That is certainly safe to say, Congresswoman.
Thank you, and I yield back.
If somebody did exactly what Mrs. Clinton did, but was one of your lieutenants, or you think one of the lieutenants under the CIA or some other agency that deals with top secret documents, what would you do to those underlings?
I would make sure that they were adjudicated through a security disciplinary proceeding to figure out what are all the circumstances and then what punishment, discipline is appropriate. That could range from being terminated to being reprimanded, and then a whole spectrum in between: suspension, loss of clearance. It's a bunch of different options.